Under the merciless frontier sun, Windwalker stood apart from the jeering crowd. His weathered face revealed nothing as the auctioneer dragged forward a young settler girl with vacant eyes. Her own father, reeking of whiskey, counted silver coins nearby. The Apache warrior's calloused hand rose, offering his last precious silver, payment for a life deemed worthless by her own blood. As he led her from the auction post, townspeople whispered warnings about the savage and the deaf girl. They rode into the painted canyons, toward his isolated camp, where silence had been his only companion since his family's massacre. That night, as he played his grandfather's flute beside the fire, he noticed her fingers tapping perfectly to the rhythm. How could a deaf girl follow music she couldn't hear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hidden canyon that Windwalker called home lay 3 days' ride from the nearest settlement. Ancient cottonwoods lined a clear stream that carved through red rock walls, their leaves whispering secrets only he understood. Here, in this natural fortress, he had rebuilt his life after loss. Windwalker secured his horse and glanced at the girl who had not spoken a word during their journey. She sat rigid on her mount, eyes darting across the unfamiliar landscape. He approached slowly, hands visible, and helped her dismount with gentle firmness. She flinched at his touch, but allowed herself to be led toward the small adobe dwelling nestled against the canyon wall. Inside, the single room held few possessions: a buffalo hide sleeping pallet, cooking implements, weapons, and tools for survival. Most precious was the bone flute that had belonged to his grandfather, its surface worn smooth from generations of hands. Windwalker motioned for the girl to sit by the cold fire pit while he rekindled yesterday's embers. 5 winters had passed since he'd returned from a hunting expedition to find his family massacred by blue-coated soldiers. His wife, Morning Star, and their son had been buried according to Apache tradition, their spirits released to the winds. The soldiers had taken his daughter, whether dead or alive, he never discovered. That day, Windwalker had died too, though. His body stubbornly continued breathing. The neighboring Mescalero Apache bands still sought his healing knowledge, respecting the boundary of his solitude. His hands remembered what his heart wished to forget: how to set bones, treat fevers, and draw poison from wounds. This knowledge kept him connected to his people, though he lived apart. The code of his ancestors had compelled him to intervene. At the auction, no child, regardless of race, should be sold like cattle. He'd seen the vacant look in the girl's eyes, the same emptiness that greeted him each morning in the still water of the stream. Now, as shadows lengthened across the canyon, floor! Windwalker wondered what madness had driven him to bring her here. What would he do with this pale-skinned deaf girl? How would they communicate? How long before someone came looking for her? He placed a wooden bowl of stew before her, rabbit with wild onions and juniper berries. She stared at it suspiciously until hunger overcame fear. Windwalker sat across from her, observing her quick, nervous movements. After eating, he motioned for her to stay by the fire while he fetched water and prepared the sleeping area. He arranged a separate pallet for her on the opposite side of the dwelling, giving her space and privacy. Night fell quickly in the canyon, stars appearing like scattered embers across the darkening sky. Windwalker lit a small oil lamp and retrieved his grandfather's flute. Its mournful notes had been his only conversation for years now, a connection to ancestors whose wisdom he sorely needed. The girl sat motionless, watching his fingers move across the polished bone. Windwalker closed his eyes, letting the ancient melodies flow through him. When he opened them again, he noticed her slender fingers tapping against her knee, perfectly matching the rhythm of his playing. He stopped abruptly, the final note hanging in the air between them. The girl's fingers stilled, and she looked up, sensing his attention. Windwalker resumed playing, watching intently as her fingers once again began to move in perfect time with the music. How could this be? The townspeople had called her deaf. He had seen no recognition in her eyes when he spoke, yet somehow she followed his music. Windwalker placed the flute in his lap and studied the girl more carefully. In the flickering lamplight, he saw fear. In her eyes, yes, but also intelligence and a wary curiosity. Sleep would not come easily this night. Tomorrow would bring new questions and perhaps, if the spirits were generous, some answers. Dawn arrived with pale fingers of light stretching across the canyon. The girl was already awake, sitting rigidly on her sleeping pallet, clutching a small bundle of cloth. Windwalker nodded a greeting she couldn't hear and set about preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal cakes. As they ate, Windwalker gestured toward himself and spoke his name slowly. The girl watched his lips with intense concentration, but made no attempt to respond. He pointed to her questioningly. After a long moment, she reached into the folds of her tattered dress and withdrew a handkerchief. Embroidered in one corner in neat faded stitches was a name, Sarah. Windwalker pointed to the handkerchief, then to her. Sarah, he said carefully. She nodded slightly, the first real acknowledgement she had given him. From the bundle of cloth, Sarah withdrew a small torn rag doll, crudely made, but obviously cherished. One arm was missing, and the yarn hair was matted, but she handled it with tender care. This worn toy, Windwalker realized, was her only possession besides the clothes on her back. Sarah had not always lived in silence. Fever had stolen her hearing. 3 winters ago, shortly after her mother's death, her father, never a kind man, grew bitter with a daughter who could not hear his commands. The whiskey he consumed daily fueled his rage at this perceived burden. Their small homestead had withered under his neglect. Debts mounted. The day he dragged her to the auction platform, Sarah had understood exactly what was happening. She had seen the cattle and horses sold before her. Now it was her turn. Her world had become a place of visual cues and vibrations. She noticed details others missed. A hawk's shadow crossing the ground, the subtle shift in expression that preceded. Anger, the tremor of approaching footsteps through the floorboards. These observations had helped her survive her father's unpredictable temper. Now, in this strange new place, Sarah's senses worked furiously to map potential dangers and escapes. The Apache man was strong, capable of ending her life with his bare hands. Yet he had treated her with unexpected gentleness. She didn't understand why he had purchased her freedom with silver coins, only to bring her to this remote canyon. The previous night, when he played his strange flute, Sarah had felt the vibrations through the packed earth floor. The rhythm had traveled up through her body, and without thinking, her fingers had tapped along. It was something she had discovered after losing her hearing, this ability to feel music through surfaces. Her father had caught her doing this once and had beaten her for pretending to hear. Windwalker rose and motioned for Sarah to follow him outside. The morning sun illuminated the canyon in breathtaking detail. Towering red walls streaked with mineral deposits, the verdant strip of vegetation following the stream's course, small game paths winding up the talus slopes. A natural fortress, Sarah realized, scanning for a way out should she need to flee. Windwalker showed her the clean water source, the food storage cache dug into the cool earth, the small corral where the horses rested. His gestures were deliberately slow, his expression neutral. Sarah watched everything with keen eyes, memorizing the layout of this place that was now, for better or worse, her home. When Windwalker retrieved a wooden bucket and pantomimed washing, Sarah understood. She took the bucket to the stream, knelt on a flat rock, and began laundering her filthy dress in the cool water. As she worked, she kept the Apache man in her peripheral vision, still uncertain of his intentions. Windwalker sat nearby, sharpening a hunting knife. He made no move toward her, giving her space while ensuring she didn't flee. Sarah wrung out her dress and spread it on a sun-warmed rock to dry. From the bundle she'd carried, she extracted a threadbare shift, her only other garment, and slipped behind a boulder to change. The silence between them was more than the absence of words. It was a gulf of cultures, experiences, and understanding that neither knew how to bridge. By the third day, Windwalker realized he needed a way to communicate with Sarah beyond simple gestures. Sitting across from her at the morning fire, he picked up a stick and drew in the dirt, a crude figure of a man, then a separate figure of a woman with long hair. He pointed to the male figure, then to himself, then to the female figure, then to Sarah. Sarah watched intently. After a moment, she took the stick and drew a wavy line between the figures. Windwalker frowned, not understanding. Sarah pointed to her lips, then to her ears, and crossed her hands in negation. The wavy line represented their inability to speak to each other. Windwalker nodded slowly. He drew a simple hand below the figures. Then he demonstrated, raising his flat hand to his forehead in the Apache sign for greeting. Sarah mimicked the gesture perfectly. For the next hour, Windwalker taught her basic Apache sign language: eat, drink, sleep, danger. Sarah absorbed each sign instantly, her eyes never leaving his hands. That afternoon, as Windwalker prepared to check his traps, Sarah followed him to the canyon entrance. He turned and firmly gestured for her to stay. She stood watching as he disappeared around a bend. When he returned with 2 rabbits, he found her kneeling by the cooking pit, a small fire already burning and water boiling in the pot. She had arranged stones in a more efficient pattern and gathered additional firewood. Windwalker nodded approval. He demonstrated how to skin the rabbits, and to his surprise, Sarah took over the task with practiced efficiency. Her father may have neglected her, but she clearly knew how to prepare game. As they worked side by side, a fragile routine began to form. The following day, Windwalker took Sarah to gather edible plants. He showed her which berries were safe, which roots could be eaten, which leaves had medicinal properties. Sarah proved a quick study, her keen eyes noting details Windwalker himself sometimes overlooked. By the end of the day, she had collected more service berries than he, finding patches he had missed. That night, as they ate a stew enriched with their gathered plants, Sarah formed a small ball of clay from the stream bed. With nimble fingers, she began shaping it into a crude bowl. Windwalker watched, then retrieved his own collection of clay vessels. He demonstrated how to smooth the surface with a wetted stone, how to score patterns with a bone awl. Sarah's eyes lit with interest as she mimicked his techniques. For 3 days, Sarah worked on her bowl, refining its shape, adding simple patterns around the rim. Windwalker fired it in the cooking pit, showing her how to maintain the proper heat. When it emerged, hardened and surprisingly symmetrical for a first attempt, Sarah's face showed the first genuine smile since her arrival. A sudden thunderstorm rolled through the canyon that evening. The first crack of thunder made Sarah jump, her eyes wide with fear. Windwalker placed his hand on the ground and motioned for her to do the same. When she did, he knew she could feel the vibration of the thunder through the earth. He pointed to the sky, then to the ground, helping her connect the sound she couldn't hear with the tremor she could feel. As rain pounded the canyon, they remained sheltered in the adobe dwelling. Windwalker noticed Sarah tracking his movements, even when her back was turned, somehow sensing his position without seeing him. When he deliberately walked softly behind her, she still turned at precisely the right moment to take a pot he was offering. Later, watching her sleep, Windwalker realized she had placed her sleeping pallet directly on the hard-packed earth floor, rather than on the raised platform he had built. She lay with one hand flat against the ground, as if listening through her fingertips to the nighttime movements of the world she could not hear. A fortnight passed. Windwalker noticed Sarah watching him intently as he performed his morning prayers. She studied his movements with the same concentration she gave to learning plant names and cooking techniques. One morning he found her attempting to mimic his prayer gestures behind the dwelling, her face solemn with effort. That evening, Windwalker retrieved a rolled piece of tanned deerskin from a cedar chest. He spread it before Sarah, revealing rows of Apache symbols and pictographs, a teaching tool his grandfather had created. Windwalker pointed to a spiral symbol, then traced the same spiral in the dirt, then pointed to the whirlpool in the stream. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. For hours, they sat together as Windwalker introduced her to Apache written language. He drew a simplified human figure, then showed her the more abstract symbol that represented person in their pictographs. Sarah traced each symbol with her finger, committing them to memory. When Windwalker drew the symbol for listen, Sarah frowned and pointed to her ears. Windwalker shook his head and placed her hand over his heart, then drew the symbol again. Listen with more than ears, he was trying to tell her. The following day, Windwalker fashioned a small board from a cedar plank and coated it with a thin layer of clay. Using a pointed stick, he could draw symbols that could be smoothed away and redrawn. This became their primary teaching tool. Sarah proved adept at creating her own symbols, sometimes improving on Windwalker's drawings with clearer representations. One morning, Windwalker found Sarah kneeling by the stream, her hand submerged in the water. He approached quietly, but she turned immediately, sensing his presence through vibrations in the earth. She beckoned him closer and guided his hand into the water beside hers. A school of tiny fish swam nearby, and Sarah showed him how she could feel their movements disturbing the water. Windwalker nodded slowly, beginning to understand how Sarah experienced the world. Sarah grew bolder in exploring the canyon. Windwalker watched as she climbed to a small ledge overlooking their camp, feeling her way with sure-footed confidence. She returned with a handful of eagle feathers, presenting them to him with a questioning look. Windwalker showed her how his people used these sacred feathers in ceremonies, demonstrating how they were tied into prayer sticks. During an evening meal, Windwalker began rhythmically tapping the ground with his foot while using a wooden spoon against his clay bowl. Sarah immediately felt the vibration and looked up. Windwalker continued the pattern, 3 short taps, 1 long, 3 short. After watching carefully, Sarah repeated the pattern perfectly on her own bowl. Windwalker smiled and created a more complex rhythm. Again, Sarah matched it flawlessly. Over the next days, they developed a system of rhythmic communication. 3 quick taps meant danger. A long roll followed by 2 taps signaled mealtime. Different patterns called Sarah to different locations in the camp. She absorbed each new signal instantly, her ability to distinguish subtle vibrations far keener than Windwalker had imagined possible. One evening, as sunset painted the canyon walls crimson, Windwalker brought out a small drum made of stretched deerskin. He began a traditional Apache melody, the drum's deep voice echoing off the canyon walls. Sarah placed her hand flat on the ground beside him, feeling the rhythm pulse through the earth. Slowly, she began swaying to the beat, her eyes closed. In concentration, Windwalker handed her the drum. Sarah hesitated, then placed it in her lap. She ran her fingers over the taut skin, feeling its tension. When she struck it tentatively, her face lit with surprise at the vibration that traveled up her arms. Windwalker guided her hands, showing her the proper striking technique. As twilight deepened into night, the unlikely pair sat beneath the emerging stars, their hands creating rhythms that needed no translation. For the first time since bringing Sarah to his canyon home, Windwalker laughed. A rusty sound, unfamiliar to his own ears. Sarah couldn't hear his laughter, but she felt his chest vibrate when she placed her hand there, and she smiled in response. Windwalker's vigilance never wavered. Each morning he scouted the canyon's perimeter, checking for signs of intruders. The isolation that had once been his penance had become their protection. One dawn, as mist still clung to the canyon floor, Windwalker discovered fresh tracks. Near the narrow entrance, unshod horses, moccasined feet, Apache riders, not cavalry scouts. Still, visitors meant danger for Sarah. Her pale skin marked her as an outsider. Windwalker returned to camp and found Sarah already awake, kneading cornmeal dough for the morning meal. He signaled her with 3 quick taps on the ground, their code for danger. Sarah immediately stopped her work, wiping her hands on her dress, now adorned with Apache-style beadwork she had crafted herself. Windwalker led her to a hidden alcove behind a rock fall, a place he had shown her during their first week together. He mimed for her to remain still and quiet, though silence was her constant companion. Sarah nodded, clutching the small knife he had given her. The question in her eyes needed no translation. Would he return? Windwalker touched his chest, then hers, a gesture that had come to mean trust between them. He covered the alcove entrance with brush and returned to camp, arranging things to appear as if he lived alone. The visitors arrived at midday. 3 warriors from his former band. Windwalker recognized Black Knife, a respected hunter, and 2 Moons, son of the band's medicine man. The third, a younger warrior called Swift Arrow, kept his hand near his knife, eyes scanning the canyon suspiciously. "The one who walks with wind spirits greets his brothers," Windwalker said in Apache, raising his hand in peace. Black Knife dismounted. "Many moons have passed since you shared fire with your people, brother. My path is walked alone, Wind." Walker replied, though the words no longer felt entirely true. "Yellowhawk's fever grows worse," 2 Moons said. "My father's medicine fails. We come seeking your healing knowledge." Windwalker nodded. Yellowhawk was an elder whose wisdom was respected throughout the scattered Apache bands. "I will prepare medicines. What are his symptoms?" As 2 Moons described the elder's illness, Swift Arrow circled the camp, examining Windwalker's dwelling. "You keep a woman's things," the young warrior said suddenly, holding up a small comb Sarah had fashioned from bone. "Has Windwalker taken?" "A wife in his solitude." Windwalker's face remained impassive. "I trade with settlers for what I need." Swift Arrow's eyes narrowed. "Blue coats have been riding the boundaries of our hunting grounds. They search for something." He held up a tarnished brass button. "I found this near your canyon entrance." Windwalker felt a chill. Cavalry scouts had come this close. Were they searching for Sarah? "The white man's hunger for our land never ends," he said carefully. "Their scouts are everywhere." Black Knife stepped forward. "Our hunters report a white man at the trading post, asking questions about a missing girl. He offers silver for information." Sarah's father. Windwalker kept his expression neutral. "The white man's troubles are not ours." "Unless you have taken what belongs to him," Swift Arrow said. "A white girl with no hearing." Windwalker's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his knife. "What I do in my solitude is my concern alone." Black Knife raised his hand for peace. "We seek only healing for Yellowhawk, not to judge Windwalker's path." Windwalker nodded and began gathering herbs for the fever medicine. As he worked, he remained acutely aware of Swift Arrow's suspicious gaze. When the preparations were complete, he wrapped the medicine bundle in a piece of clean deerskin and handed it to 2 Moons, with instructions for its use. "Tell Yellowhawk I honor his wisdom," Windwalker said. "May these medicines ease his journey." The visitors prepared to depart, but Black Knife lingered. "The soldier chief at the fort speaks of peace while sending scouts into our hunting grounds. Be vigilant, brother. Trouble stirs like dust before the storm." After they rode away, Windwalker waited until their dust trail had settled before retrieving Sarah. As he helped her from the alcove, he found himself relieved beyond measure at her safety. When had this deaf white girl's well-being become so essential to his peace? That night, Windwalker added new symbols to their deerskin book, signs for cavalry, for hiding, for silence. Sarah's quick mind absorbed the warnings, but he saw the fear that now shadowed her eyes. Their sanctuary was no longer unknown. The seasons shifted. Summer heat gave way to autumn's gentle touch. Windwalker and Sarah fell into the comfortable rhythms of shared lives. Then, without warning, Sarah fell ill. Windwalker found her shivering beside the morning fire, her skin burning with fever. Fear clutched his heart, a sensation he had not felt since discovering his family's bodies years before. Sarah tried to rise when she saw his concern, but her legs buckled beneath her. He carried her to her sleeping pallet, covering her with every blanket they possessed. Her forehead burned against his palm, her eyes glazed with delirium. Windwalker recognized the symptoms of mountain fever, the same illness that had claimed his wife, Morning Star, despite all his healing skills. Memories crashed upon him like a thunderstorm. Morning Star's final days, her breath labored, her once strong hands limp in his, the helplessness that had crushed him as he watched death claim her, the bitter knowledge that his medicine had failed when she needed it most. But Sarah was not. Morning Star, and Windwalker was no longer the broken man who had retreated to this canyon to die. He would not fail again. With grim determination, he retrieved his medicine pouch, a small deerskin bag containing the sacred healing tools of his people. Inside were rare herbs gathered from mountain heights, crystals believed to draw out sickness, and the carefully preserved wing of a healing moth. Windwalker built a small fire beside Sarah's pallet and began the healing ritual his grandfather had taught him. He crushed juniper berries and white sage into a stone bowl, adding water from the spring. As he worked, he sang the ancient healing songs of his people, sounds Sarah could not hear, but whose vibrations she might feel through the earth beneath her. Throughout the day and into the night, Windwalker bathed Sarah's burning forehead with cool cloths, dribbled herbal teas between her parched lips, and placed poultices of crushed yarrow on her chest. When her fever spiked dangerously high, he carried her to the stream and held her in the cool water until her skin cooled. By the second night, Windwalker had not slept. His voice grew hoarse from constant singing, his hands cramped from grinding herbs. Still, Sarah's fever raged. In desperation, he retrieved a special root wrapped in a separate cloth within his medicine pouch, a powerful medicine his grandfather had claimed could pull even a spirit halfway to the ancestor world back to the living. The root was rare and sacred, meant to be used only in the direst circumstances. Windwalker had been saving it, perhaps for his own final journey. Now he crushed it into a fine powder and mixed it with spring water and wild honey. Lifting Sarah's head gently, he helped her swallow the bitter mixture. Through the darkest hours before dawn, Windwalker kept vigil. He placed his hand over Sarah's heart, feeling its rapid flutter beneath his palm. "Fight, little one," he whispered in Apache, words she couldn't hear, but which he needed to say. "Your path is not finished." As the first light of dawn touched the canyon rim, Sarah's fever broke. Her breathing eased and her skin cooled beneath Windwalker's touch. When her eyes opened, clear and aware once more, Windwalker felt something within his chest unlock, a door he had sealed shut after Morning Star's death. Sarah recovered swiftly over the next days. As her strength returned, her curiosity about Windwalker's healing practices grew. She would sit beside him as he sorted herbs, her quick fingers learning to identify each plant by texture and scent. Windwalker showed her how to prepare poultices, how to brew healing teas, how to determine dosages by age and size. To Windwalker's surprise, Sarah displayed a natural talent for healing work. Her sensitive fingers could detect subtle differences in plant textures that even he sometimes missed. She created her own system of organizing the herbs, arranging them by use rather than type, a method Windwalker had never considered but immediately recognized as superior. One evening, as they sat cataloging a day's gathering of medicinal plants, Sarah reached for Windwalker's medicine pouch with a questioning look. He hesitated only briefly before handing her the sacred bag. As she examined each item with reverent care, Windwalker realized he was passing on his knowledge just as his grandfather had done for him, creating a bridge across time, across cultures, across the silence that separated them, yet somehow had brought them together. After Sarah's recovery, Windwalker noticed a change in her. She moved with new confidence, her connection to their shared environment deepening. One morning, he found her sitting perfectly still at the canyon's edge, her palm flat against the stone, her eyes closed in concentration. That evening, Windwalker retrieved an item he had not used since retreating to the canyon, the ceremonial drum of his ancestors. Crafted from a hollowed cedar trunk and covered with stretched elk hide, its surface was adorned with symbols of the 4 directions. Windwalker had carried it away from his village after the massacre, unable to leave this sacred object behind, yet too wounded to use it. He placed the drum before Sarah, who examined it with reverent fingers. She traced the painted symbols, her touch lingering on the taut drumhead. Windwalker sat cross-legged opposite her and lifted the drumming stick, a polished length of lightning-struck pine wrapped with rabbit fur at one end. The first beat resonated through the canyon, disturbing. Ravens from their perches. Sarah's head tilted, her eyes widening as she felt the vibration travel through the earth into her body. Windwalker continued, creating the slow, steady rhythm of the heartbeat drum, the foundation of all Apache sacred music. Sarah placed her hand directly on the drum's surface, her fingers splayed to capture every nuance of vibration. Windwalker guided her other hand to her own heart, helping her feel the connection between the drum's voice and her pulse. A look of wonder crossed her face as she understood. Over the next days, Windwalker introduced Sarah to the sacred rhythms of his people, the healing beat, the prayer rhythm, the celebration pattern. Sarah absorbed each one, feeling their differences through her fingertips and feet. Windwalker noticed her sitting beside the drum for hours, sometimes lightly touching its surface, other times merely feeling its presence. One evening, as Windwalker played the ceremony rhythm, Sarah rose spontaneously and began to move. Her dance was hesitant at first, uncertain, but as the drum beats pulsed through the earth into her bare feet, her movements grew more confident. She had never heard the music that traditionally accompanied this drum, yet somehow her body found the ancient patterns, her hands rising and falling with surprising accuracy. Windwalker's drumming faltered momentarily in astonishment. Sarah immediately stopped, sensing the rhythm change. She looked at him questioningly. Windwalker resumed the proper beat, and Sarah continued her dance, following the vibrations that traveled from his hands through the drum into the ground beneath. As moonlight spilled into the canyon, casting silver shadows across the red rocks, Windwalker played pattern after pattern. Sarah danced to each one, her movements becoming more fluid, more precise with each passing moment. This girl who had never heard music was dancing as if born to it, sensing rhythms that many hearing people missed. The following morning, Windwalker placed the drum in Sarah's lap. He guided her hands, showing her how to strike the surface to produce different tones. Sarah's first attempts were tentative, but she quickly discovered how to feel the drum's response through her fingertips. By midday, she could replicate the basic heartbeat rhythm. By evening, she had mastered 3 distinct patterns. Windwalker watched in amazement as Sarah closed her eyes, completely absorbed in the tactile conversation between her hands and the ancient instrument. That night, something extraordinary happened. Windwalker was awakened by a vibration traveling through the ground. He opened his eyes to find Sarah sitting in the moonlight, playing the ceremonial drum with perfect precision. Her eyes were closed, her expression serene as her hands created rhythms she had never heard, only felt. For the first time, Windwalker understood the true nature of Sarah's gift. Her deafness had not cut her off from music. It had given her a different way of hearing it, through her body, through the earth, through the space between heartbeats. Days later, Windwalker took Sarah to a sacred place in the canyon, a natural amphitheater where sound reflected in unusual ways. He positioned her in the center and played the drum from different locations. Sarah turned unerringly toward each new position, tracking him not by sight, but by feeling how the vibrations changed direction and intensity. As they walked back to camp, Sarah reached for Windwalker's hand, the first time she had initiated such contact. She placed his palm against the canyon wall, then pressed her own hand beside his, her eyes conveying what words could not. We hear the same world, just differently. The hunter's moon rose full and golden over the canyon rim. 6 months had passed since Windwalker had brought Sarah to his hidden home. Summer's heat had yielded to autumn's crisp embrace. Soon, winter would test their preparations. Windwalker watched Sarah move through the camp, gathering the last of the season's berries. Her once thin frame had filled out with proper nourishment, her movements now confident and purposeful. Isha, frightened girl from the auction block, had transformed into a capable young woman who could identify healing plants, prepare meals, and communicate through an intricate language of signs and vibrations they had created together. Yet the world beyond the canyon remained dangerous. Windwalker knew Sarah needed more than domestic skills to survive. She needed to hunt, to defend herself if necessary. That morning, Windwalker presented Sarah with a gift, a hunting bow he had crafted from seasoned juniper wood, smaller than his own and perfectly suited to her height and strength. Sarah ran her fingers along the smooth curve, testing the tension of the sinew string with a look of wonder. In the days that followed, Windwalker taught Sarah the fundamentals of archery. Her keen eye and steady hands made her a natural, but what truly surprised him was her extraordinary stealth. Without the distraction of sound, Sarah moved through the forest like a shadow, noticing visual details that even Windwalker sometimes missed. The slight movement of branches indicating wind direction, the subtle change in bird flight patterns, signaling a predator's presence. Windwalker showed her how to track deer through the underbrush, how to read the age and direction of prints, how to predict an animal's path. Sarah absorbed these lessons eagerly, adding her own observations that sometimes caught Windwalker by surprise with their insight. 2 weeks after beginning her training, Sarah accompanied Windwalker on a full hunt. They moved silently through the autumn forest, following the trail of a young buck. When they finally spotted their quarry grazing in a small clearing, Windwalker motioned for Sarah to take the shot. She nocked an arrow, drew the bowstring to her cheek with perfect form, and released. The arrow flew true, striking the buck behind the shoulder. A clean, merciful kill. Windwalker felt pride swell in his chest as he showed Sarah the proper way to honor the animal spirit, to use every part of the gift it had given them. That night, as they feasted on fresh venison, Windwalker noticed Sarah's expression grow distant, troubled. When the meal ended, she retrieved their picture board and drew a simple figure, a man with a bottle. Her father. Windwalker nodded in understanding. Sarah's first successful hunt had triggered memories of her past life. He watched as she added to the drawing, stick figures in blue uniforms, horses, guns. She was worried about soldiers searching. For her, about her father's claims that she had been stolen. Windwalker took the drawing stick and carefully crossed out the figures, then drew the canyon walls around their own symbols. Safe, he was telling her. We are safe here. Sarah shook her head. She drew hoofprints leading to their canyon. Visitors would come again, perhaps enemies. Windwalker couldn't deny the truth of her concern. He added to the drawing 2 figures side by side, each holding a bow. They would face whatever came together. That night, Sarah's sleep was troubled by nightmares. Windwalker awakened to find her trembling on her sleeping pallet, her hands moving in frantic gestures. He knelt beside her, gently grasping her shoulders. Until she opened her eyes and recognized him. Sarah pointed to her eyes, then made a running motion with her fingers. She had seen something in her dreams. People searching, coming closer. Windwalker didn't dismiss her fear. The dreams of those touched by the spirits often carried warnings. The following day, Windwalker carved protective symbols into Sarah's bow, ancient Apache signs meant to ward off evil and bring accuracy to the hunter. As he worked, he added another symbol, one not traditionally used on weapons, the sign for family. When he presented the finished bow to Sarah, her fingers traced the newly carved markings, lingering on the family symbol. Her questioning eyes met his. Windwalker placed his hand over his heart, then over hers. The gesture needed no translation. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them not as protector and protected, but as family, bound by something stronger than blood or language. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the canyon floor, Windwalker watched Sarah practice. With her newly marked bow, each arrow found its target with uncanny precision. In the fading light, her silhouette against the red canyon walls looked like it belonged there, had always belonged there. Winter arrived with a quiet snowfall that blanketed the canyon in pristine white. Windwalker and Sarah were well prepared. Their storage cache filled with dried meat, preserved berries, and medicinal herbs. Yet certain supplies could not be gathered from the land. Salt, coffee, ammunition for Windwalker's ancient rifle, needles for Sarah's growing skill at leatherwork. Windwalker had avoided the trading post since bringing Sarah to the canyon. Now, necessity drove them from their sanctuary. He explained through their pictograph board that they must journey to the white man's trading place. Sarah's face paled, but she nodded with determined acceptance. They departed before dawn. Windwalker leading the way on his painted horse, Sarah following on the smaller mare she had come to consider her own. He had dressed her in Apache clothing, a deerskin dress adorned with beadwork she had crafted herself, high moccasins, and a rabbit fur cloak against the winter chill. With her sun-darkened skin and hair braided in Apache fashion, only her blue eyes marked her as different. They traveled cautiously, Windwalker constantly scanning for cavalry patrols. Though the frontier had been relatively peaceful in recent months, the bluecoats still regarded lone Apache warriors with suspicion. A white girl in his company would raise questions Windwalker preferred to avoid. The journey took 2 days, requiring them to camp overnight in a sheltered ravine. Windwalker noticed Sarah's increasing tension as they approached civilization. Her hands trembled slightly as she helped prepare their simple camp meal. That night, she slept fitfully, her hand always near the knife at her waist. By midday of the second day, they reached Wilson's trading post, a sturdy log structure serving as the last outpost of white civilization before Apache territory. A handful of wagons and horses stood outside, belonging to trappers, prospectors, and the occasional settler brave or foolish enough to venture this far into the frontier. Windwalker approached cautiously, studying the gathering before committing to enter. Sarah stayed close behind him, her eyes darting nervously across the unfamiliar scene. They dismounted at a distance, and Windwalker secured their horses to a hitching post. He placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder before leading her toward the trading post's entrance. Conversation halted as they entered. All eyes turned to the tall Apache warrior and the slight figure behind him. Windwalker felt Sarah press closer to his back, seeking protection from the stares. He kept his expression impassive as he approached the counter where Wilson himself stood, wiping a glass with a dirty cloth. "Windwalker," the trader acknowledged with a cautious nod. "Been some time." Windwalker placed a bundle of prime furs on the counter. "Trade," he said simply in English. Wilson examined the pelts with professional interest. "Good quality, what do you need?" Windwalker listed his requirements in halting English. As Wilson gathered the items, whispered conversations resumed among the other customers, their eyes continually darting towards Sarah, who kept her face partially hidden beneath her hood. A woman emerged from the back room. Wilson's wife, a kind-faced settler who had always treated Windwalker fairly. Her eyes widened at the sight of Sarah. "Is the girl unwell?" she asked, noting how Sarah clung to Windwalker's shadow. "She is well," Windwalker replied. "Cannot hear, cannot speak." Mrs. Wilson approached slowly, her expression softening with his sympathy. "Poor child, is she your—" She hesitated, uncertain how to phrase her question. "I protect," Windwalker said simply. Mrs. Wilson smiled at Sarah, who cautiously met her eyes. The trader's wife reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small mirror framed in polished wood. She offered it to Sarah with a gentle smile. Sarah looked to Windwalker, who nodded his permission. With trembling fingers, she accepted the gift, her eyes widening at her own reflection, perhaps the first time she had clearly seen herself since coming to live with Windwalker. While Wilson calculated the trade value of the furs, his wife disappeared into the back room. She returned moments later with a folded length of vibrant red fabric, a woolen shawl of remarkable quality. "For the girl," she said, offering it to Windwalker. "Winter nights get cold." Windwalker knew the shawl was worth more than his remaining furs. He began to shake his head, but Mrs. Wilson pressed it into his hands. "Please," she insisted. "She needs it more than my shop needs another shawl." As Windwalker completed the trade, a group of rough-looking men entered the post. Their conversation died when they spotted the Apache. One man elbowed another, whispering something that made his companions stare hard at Sarah. Windwalker gathered their supplies quickly, nodding thanks to Mrs. Wilson. As they turned to leave, he heard one man say clearly, "Looks like that deaf girl the drunk was selling, the one that went missing." Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she sensed Windwalker's sudden tension. They hurried outside, mounted their horses, and rode away from the trading post at a pace just short of suspicious haste. The red shawl, carefully folded in Sarah's saddlebag, would remind them both of the danger and kindness that existed beyond their canyon sanctuary. They rode hard for 2 days, taking a circuitous route back to the canyon. Windwalker's instincts screamed danger, and he no longer doubted Sarah's nightmares had been prophetic. Word had spread. Her father was searching for her, and in the frontier's twisted justice, an Apache stealing a white girl, even one sold by her own father, would face swift retribution. On the morning of the 3rd day, Windwalker spotted dust clouds on the horizon, multiple riders moving with military precision. Cavalry patrol. He led Sarah into a dense copse of junipers, where they watched from concealment as a squad of blue-coated soldiers passed within 100 yards, led by a civilian tracker. Sarah's face went pale with recognition. Even from this distance, the slouched posture and whiskey-reddened face were unmistakable. Her father. They waited until nightfall before continuing, traveling under a moonless sky that protected them from searching eyes, but made the journey treacherous. Sarah's mare nearly stumbled into a ravine, saved only by her rider's quick reflexes and intimate knowledge of the terrain gained through months of hunting with Windwalker. When they finally reached the canyon entrance, Windwalker knew immediately. Something was wrong. Fresh tracks marked the narrow passage, unshod horses and boots bearing the distinctive pattern of cavalry issue. Their sanctuary had been discovered. Windwalker signaled Sarah to remain hidden while he scouted ahead. The canyon appeared deserted, but their dwelling had been ransacked. Inside, everything lay in disarray. Sleeping pallets slashed open, storage vessels smashed, Windwalker's few possessions scattered across the dirt floor. Most disturbing of all was a piece of paper nailed to the center post, a crudely drawn image of a man hanging from a tree. Below it, in block letters, "Savage Child Stealer," a wanted poster. When Sarah entered the devastated dwelling, her hands flew to her mouth. In horror, Windwalker quickly turned the poster over before she could see it, but couldn't hide the destruction. He watched as she moved through the wreckage, straightening what could be salvaged, her face a mask of controlled anguish. She paused at her sleeping area, kneeling to retrieve something from beneath a torn blanket, her rag doll now missing its remaining arm. Tears streamed silently down her face as she clutched the mutilated toy to her chest. Windwalker placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. When she looked up, he signed that they must leave immediately. The soldiers would return, perhaps with reinforcements. The canyon was no longer safe. They worked swiftly, gathering only essential supplies, weapons, medicine pouch, the ceremonial drum, food for the journey. As Sarah rolled blankets into tight bundles, Windwalker uncovered a hidden cache beneath. The floor, a small leather pouch containing a few gold coins and the silver trade piece he had used to purchase Sarah's freedom. Emergency wealth he had traded furs for over many years. Within an hour, they had packed what they could carry on horseback. Before departing, Windwalker performed a brief ceremony, asking the canyon spirits to forgive their hasty departure and protect their path. Sarah joined him, placing her hands on the earth in farewell to the place that had become her first true home. They rode deeper into Apache territory, toward the winter camp of Windwalker's former band. He had not sought their company in years, but ancient bonds of kinship might now be their only hope. If they refused shelter, he and Sarah would face the coming winter alone, pursued by both cavalry and vengeful settlers. As darkness fell, they made a cold camp in a sheltered overhang, no fire that might betray their position. Sarah huddled beneath her new red shawl, shivering not from cold, but from fear. Windwalker sat beside her, his rifle across his knees, scanning the darkness for threats. Using the last light of dusk, Sarah drew on their picture board. She sketched two figures, herself and Windwalker, then drew a circle around them, followed by many hostile figures outside the circle. Her meaning was clear. The world had closed in around them. Windwalker took the drawing stick and added to her image the circle of his tribe around the two of them, offering protection. Then he drew a second circle encompassing everything, the great spirit that watched over all paths, even the darkest ones. Sarah studied his addition, then leaned her head against his shoulder in a gesture of trust. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. The bond between them had been forged in silence, but had grown stronger than words could express, stronger even than the fear that now pursued them across the winter landscape. The winter camp of the Mescalero Apache band spread across a protected valley, a collection of hide-covered dwellings arranged in the traditional circle. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns against the grey sky as Windwalker and Sarah approached from downwind, allowing the camp sentries ample time to identify them. 3 mounted warriors intercepted them before they reached the camp's edge. Windwalker raised his hand in the peace sign, speaking in rapid Apache to explain their situation. The warriors' eyes moved constantly to Sarah, their expressions guarded but not openly hostile. After a brief consultation, the warriors escorted them into the camp. Children stopped their play to stare at the newcomers. Women paused in their work, watching with curious eyes as Windwalker and Sarah dismounted at the center of the camp. Standing Bear, the band's chief, emerged from his dwelling. Now in his 6th decade, his face was deeply lined, but his bearing remained proud and strong. He'd been a friend to Windwalker's father and had mourned with Windwalker after the massacre of his family. The Lone One returns to his people, Standing Bear said formally in Apache, and brings a pale-faced child with no hearing. Windwalker bowed his head respectfully. I seek shelter for the one under my protection. The bluecoats hunt us. Standing Bear's expression hardened. Because you took what was not yours to take. I purchased her freedom from a father who sold her like a horse, Windwalker replied evenly. She was mistreated. Now her father claims she was stolen. Standing Bear studied Sarah, who stood quietly beside Windwalker, her eyes moving alertly over the gathering crowd. Though clearly nervous, she showed no fear, meeting the stares of the tribe with a calm dignity beyond her years. The tribal own council will decide, Standing Bear finally pronounced. Until then, you may shelter with 2 ravens, who was cousin to your father. An elderly woman stepped forward. 2 Ravens' wife, Grey Dove. She beckoned to Sarah with a gentle motion. Sarah looked to Windwalker, who nodded encouragement. With visible hesitation, Sarah followed the older woman toward one of the dwellings. The tribal council convened at sunset. 12 elders seated in a circle around the central fire. Windwalker stood before them, presenting his case with the formal eloquence his father had taught him. He explained how he had found Sarah being auctioned, how he had paid fair price for her freedom, and how he had discovered her unique ability to feel music and rhythms through the earth. Swift arrow, the young warrior who had visited Windwalkers. Icanyon months before spoke against him. He brings the white man's vengeance upon us all for the sake of a deaf girl child. What is she to our people? Nothing but danger. Others voiced similar concerns. The Bluecoats needed little reason to attack Apache camps. Harboring a white girl, even one legally purchased, would give them the excuse they sought. As the debate continued, a commotion arose from the edge of the gathering. The children of the tribe were leading Sarah forward, their small hands guiding her to the council circle. Grey Dove followed, her wrinkled face creased with an unexpected smile. The children had clearly taken to Sarah during the council meeting. Now they guided her to the ceremonial drum that sat silent beside the fire. With solemn expressions, they placed her hands upon the drum's surface. One of the tribal drummers began a slow, traditional rhythm on a smaller hand drum. Sarah sat perfectly still, her eyes closed in concentration as she felt the vibration. Then, with no guidance beyond what she felt through her fingers, she began to play the large ceremonial drum in perfect counterpoint to the rhythm she could not hear. A hush fell over the council. Even Swift Arrow stared in amazement as Sarah matched the complex rhythm flawlessly, her face transfixed with the joy of participation in something she had never before experienced. Making music with others, White Crow, the oldest of the medicine. Women rose shakily to her feet. "The spirits speak through her hands," she declared. "This child hears what even those with ears cannot." Standing, Bear raised his hand for silence. "Windwalker, you have brought a strange gift to our people. The council will continue its deliberation, but the girl may stay among us while we decide." That night, Sarah slept in Grey Dove's dwelling, surrounded by curious but increasingly friendly children. Windwalker remained outside, watching the stars wheel overhead and contemplating the strangeness of the path that had brought them to this moment. In the morning, he found Sarah in the company of the tribe's women who were teaching her their crafts with surprising patience, using gestures and demonstrations that needed no words. When they presented her with a ceremonial dress, a simple deerskin garment adorned with traditional beadwork, Sarah's face shone with a happiness Windwalker had never before witnessed. For the first time since fleeing the canyon, Windwalker allowed himself to hope. Perhaps here, among his people, Sarah might find not just safety, but belonging. A week passed in the winter camp. Sarah's presence, initially controversial, gradually became accepted as she demonstrated her willingness to work alongside the women, her quick mastery of tribal crafts, and her extraordinary connection to the ceremonial drum. The children especially had embraced her, developing a simple sign language to communicate with the girl who feels the earth's voice. White Crow, the eldest medicine woman, watched Sarah with increasing interest. One evening, as the tribe gathered for the nightly council, "Fire!" she approached Windwalker. "The Pale One has been touched by the spirits," White Crow said, her ancient voice barely above a whisper. "Her deafness is not a curse, but a doorway. She hears what we cannot." Windwalker nodded slowly. "I have seen this. She feels the approach of riders before they appear. She knows when animals move nearby without seeing them." White Crow's eyes glittered in the firelight. "She should undergo the vision quest. The spirits have something to tell her, and perhaps through her, to tell us all." Windwalker frowned. The vision quest was sacred, traditionally reserved for Apache youth transitioning to adulthood. Yet he had witnessed enough of Sarah's unusual gifts to consider the old woman's suggestion. "She is not of our blood," he said cautiously. "The spirits do not see with our eyes," White Crow replied. "They have already chosen her. We merely acknowledge what is." That night, Windwalker explained the vision quest to Sarah through their private language of signs and drawings. Her eyes widened with both fear and fascination as he described how she would spend a day and night alone on the sacred mesa, fasting. and opening herself to the spirit world. Sarah's hands moved in a flurry of questions. Was she worthy? Would the spirits speak to a deaf white girl? What if she saw nothing? Windwalker assured her that the vision quest was not about worthiness, but openness. The spirits would show her what she needed to see, whether through images, feelings, or the vibrations she was uniquely attuned to perceive. 3 days later, after careful preparation under White Crow's guidance, Sarah was ready. The tribe gathered at dawn, as Windwalker and White Crow led Sarah to the trail, ascending the sacred mesa. She wore the ceremonial dress given to her by the tribe, now adorned with protective symbols. Around her neck hung a small medicine pouch, containing sacred herbs and a tiny carved stone bear, symbol of strength and healing. At the base of the trail, White Crow painted Sarah's face with red ochre and white clay in the traditional patterns of a vision seeker. Windwalker gave her a water skin, the only sustenance allowed during her quest, and embraced her briefly before stepping back. Sarah began the climb alone, her small figure growing more distant as she ascended the winding trail. Windwalker watched until she disappeared over the mesa's rim, fighting the protective instinct that urged him to follow. "She is in the hands of the spirits now," White Crow said, touching his arm gently. "Have faith in what you have taught her." The day passed with agonizing slowness for Windwalker. He busied himself with camp duties, but his thoughts remained with Sarah on the windswept mesa above. When night fell, he found himself unable to sleep, staring instead at the stars and wondering if Sarah was watching the same constellations from her solitary vigil point. Dawn broke clear and cold. Windwalker and White Crow climbed the mesa trail. As the first rays of sunlight gilded the landscape, they found Sarah seated cross-legged on a flat stone, her face still bearing the ceremonial paint, her eyes closed in deep meditation. When Windwalker touched her shoulder, Sarah opened her eyes slowly, as if returning from a great distance. Her gaze held a new depth, a knowing that had not been there before. She reached for their picture board and began to draw with trembling fingers. First she sketched cavalry soldiers approaching the winter camp from the south, then Apache warriors riding from the north. Between them she drew a valley with 2 paths, one leading to confrontation, the other to peace. At the fork where the paths divided, she drew herself standing with arms outstretched. White Crow studied the drawing, her wrinkled face solemn. "She has seen the coming conflict," the old woman said. "The spirits have shown her a choice that must be made." Sarah added to the drawing, dark clouds gathering, rain falling, but the rain fell only on one path, the path of peace. On the other path, she drew lightning striking the earth. "The spirits have chosen her as a bridge between worlds," White Crow declared. "She stands between your people and mine, between war and peace." As they descended the mesa, Windwalker noticed an eagle circling overhead. Without warning, it dropped. A feather that spiraled down to land at Sarah's feet. She picked it up reverently, her fingers tracing its perfect form. White Crow gasped softly. "The messenger of the sky spirits acknowledges her vision. This is a powerful sign." That evening, Standing Bear called a special council. Sarah sat in the circle of elders, an unprecedented honor for one so young and an outsider. With Windwalker translating her signs, she shared her vision of soldiers approaching, of conflict brewing, and of her role in preventing bloodshed. When she finished, Standing Bear presented her with a leather cord to bind the eagle feather into her hair, marking her as one who had received true vision. "The child with no hearing has been given great wisdom," he proclaimed. "We would be fools not to listen." 3 days after Sarah's vision quest, a hunting party returned to camp with troubling news. They had spotted cavalry scouts less than a day's ride from the winter encampment, more soldiers than usual, moving with purpose rather than on routine patrol. Standing Bear called an emergency council. Windwalker and the tribal warriors gathered in the chief's dwelling as a bitter wind howled outside, carrying the first flakes of a winter storm. The bluecoats move in force, Black Knife reported. 2 full squads with supply wagons. They have a civilian tracker with them, a man who drinks spirits and speaks loudly of finding his stolen daughter. Windwalker's jaw tightened. Sarah's father had convinced the cavalry to mount a significant expedition, likely claiming that the Apache had kidnapped his daughter. Such accusations had led to massacres before. We should strike first, Swift Arrow urged. Ambush them in the narrow pass while the coming storm covers our approach. Several warriors nodded agreement, but Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. We have maintained peace through this winter. I will not be the one to break it without certainty of their intentions. The debate continued as Windwalker slipped away to find Sarah. He discovered her with White Crow and several children near the edge of camp. The moment she saw his expression, Sarah sensed something was wrong. She dismissed the children with gentle signs and approached him, her questioning eyes searching his face. Windwalker explained about the approaching soldiers. Sarah's face paled, but she showed no panic. Instead, she knelt suddenly and placed both palms flat against the frozen ground, closing her eyes in deep concentration. After a long moment, her eyes flew open. She gestured urgently for the picture board they still used for complex communications. With swift, sure strokes, she drew a detailed map of the surrounding territory. She marked the location of the Apache camp, then drew a line of horses and men approaching from the south, exactly where the hunting party had reported seeing cavalry. But then she added something unexpected, a second group approaching from the east, moving more slowly but with equal purpose. White Crow leaned close, her wrinkled face tense. How does she know this? The hunters saw nothing from the eastern pass. Windwalker watched in amazement as Sarah continued drawing. She indicated the number of men in each group with tally marks, 24 from the south, 18 from the east. Then she drew the distinctive shape of cannons being pulled behind the eastern group. Artillery, Windwalker whispered. They come not just to find Sarah, but to wage war. Sarah wasn't finished. She drew herself standing at a high point overlooking both approaching forces. Then she added the tribal symbol for listen beside her figure. She believes she can help, White Crow interpreted, that she can sense their movements through the earth. Windwalker hurried back to the council with Sarah and her crude map. The tribal leaders fell silent as Sarah knelt in their midst, spreading her drawing before them. Through Windwalker's translation, she explained what she had felt, the distinctive rhythm of marching men and horses from 2 directions, the heavy rumble of wheeled cannon. Skeptical at first, the warriors became convinced when Sarah closed her eyes and pointed precisely in the direction of both approaching forces, then held up fingers to indicate their approximate distance. She was sensing their movements through vibrations in the earth itself, with an accuracy that astonished even those who had witnessed her drum playing. Standing Bear studied the map with grave concern. If she is correct, they mean to catch us. Between their forces, this is not a search party, but a planned attack. Swift Arrow pounded his fist on the ground. We must fight. They leave us no choice. But Sarah shook her head vehemently. She pointed to her vision drawing from days before. The forked path, one leading to battle, one to peace. She had seen both possibilities. Standing Bear looked from the map to Sarah's earnest face. How can we find the path of peace when they come with cannon and rifles? Sarah pointed to herself, then to Windwalker. She mimed riding out to meet the soldiers. Windwalker understood immediately. She believes we can prevent the attack by proving she was not stolen, that she chose to stay with us. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the council. They will not listen, Black Knife argued. They will shoot you both before you can speak. Sarah's hands moved in a flurry of signs that Windwalker translated. I can lead you to a place where we can observe both forces without being seen. We can learn their true intentions before deciding. Standing, Bear considered this, then nodded slowly. The girl who feels the earth may guide us. We will send our fastest scouts with Windwalker and the girl. The rest will prepare the camp. either for quick departure or for defense. As the council dispersed, Windwalker knelt beside Sarah. Her small hand found his, squeezing with surprising strength. The storm of conflict was approaching from two directions, just as she had foreseen. Whether they could find the path that led away from bloodshed remained to be seen. But for the first time, the Apache were listening to what a deaf girl could hear that they could not. The vibrations of a changing world, trembling on the edge of violence or peace. Before dawn, Windwalker and Sarah departed the Apache camp, accompanied by Black Knife and two young warriors. Sarah wore her red shawl over Apache clothing, a deliberate choice that symbolized her existence between two worlds. The eagle feather from her vision quest remained tied in her hair, a reminder of the spirit's guidance. They traveled swiftly through terrain. Windwalker knew intimately from childhood, hidden paths through snow-dusted canyons, routes invisible to all but those born to this land. Sarah rode confidently beside him, periodically dismounting to place her hands against rock faces or the frozen ground, sensing vibrations that confirmed her earlier predictions. By midday, they reached the ridge Sarah had indicated on her map. Below them stretched a vast basin, and in the distance they spotted the dust of the Southern Cavalry detachment, exactly where Sarah had drawn them. Black Knife's eyes widened in astonishment. "The girl who feels the earth speaks true," he murmured. "They come, as she said, from both directions." Through his spyglass, Windwalker observed the cavalry column. At its head rode an officer he recognized, Captain Reynolds from Fort Davis, known for his harsh treatment of captured Apache. Beside him rode a slumped figure on a mule, Sarah's father, his distinctive red-faced profile unmistakable even at this distance. "The whiskey drinker has convinced the Blue Coat Chief that we stole his daughter," Windwalker told the others. "They will not stop until they find her, or spill Apache blood trying." Black Knife pointed eastward. "The second force comes there, carrying the big guns. By nightfall, they will be positioned to strike our camp from two sides." Sarah tugged at Windwalker's sleeve, her expression urgent. She pointed down the ridge toward the cavalry, then to herself. Windwalker shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. They might shoot first and ask questions later." Sarah's hands moved in determined gestures. "My father wants me. If I go to them voluntarily and show I am unharmed, they will have no reason to attack the Apache. Your father sold you," Windwalker reminded her through signs. "He only seeks you now for the reward the army has offered." Sarah nodded grimly. She understood this truth, but signed, "I must try. Too many will die otherwise." The group withdrew to a sheltered overhang to debate their options. Black Knife argued for returning to warn the camp, allowing the people to scatter into the mountains before the soldiers arrived. The younger warriors favored setting an ambush to slow the cavalry's advance. Windwalker listened to all views, but his eyes remained on Sarah, who sat slightly apart, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. Not random designs, but a detailed map of Fort Davis, which she had never seen but had heard described by Windwalker during their months together. "There is another way," Windwalker finally said. "We ride directly to Fort Davis, avoiding both columns. We speak to the fort commander before the attack begins." Black Knife looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Ride voluntarily into the Bluecoats' stronghold. They will hang you as a child stealer. Not if Sarah shows she is with me by choice," Windwalker countered. "Not if we carry a white flag and arrive before the soldiers return with her drunken father." Sarah nodded vigorously, her eyes bright with approval. "The fort commander is Colonel Matthews," Windwalker continued. "I have traded with him before. He is a hard man, but not bloodthirsty. He might listen where Captain Reynolds would not." After heated debate, they reached agreement. Black Knife and one warrior would return to warn the camp, while the other warrior would shadow the cavalry columns, observing their movements. Windwalker and Sarah would attempt the dangerous journey to Fort Davis, a desperate gamble to prevent a massacre. Before they parted, Sarah untied her red shawl and tore a strip from its edge. She attached this crimson cloth to a slender branch, creating a makeshift white flag, though red was all they had. Black knife clasped Windwalker's arm in the warrior's grip. May your ancestors guide your path, brother. The fate of our people rides with you. The journey to Fort Davis required crossing open terrain where they would be vulnerable to patrols. They traveled at night when possible, hiding during daylight hours. Sarah's ability to sense approaching riders through ground vibrations proved invaluable, allowing them to avoid 3 separate cavalry detachments. On the second night, a snowstorm engulfed them, both blessing and curse. The swirling white provided cover, but threatened them with freezing temperatures. They huddled in a shallow cave, sharing body heat as the wind howled outside. Windwalker wrapped Sarah in his buffalo robe, watching her shiver despite the covering. "We can turn back," he signed, his fingers stiff with cold. Sarah shook her head stubbornly. She pointed forward, then formed the sign for peace. By dawn of the third day, the storm had passed. They crested a rise to see Fort Davis in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a palisade wall, the American flag snapping in the bitter wind. Windwalker felt Sarah stiffen beside him. Following her gaze, he spotted a patrol returning to the fort, and riding beside the blue-coated soldiers was her father, his distinctive slouch unmistakable even at this distance. Their advantage of arriving before Sarah's father was lost. Now they would have to face not only the fort commander, but also the man who had sold his daughter and then claimed she was stolen. The path to peace had just become far more treacherous. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of crimson as wind. Walker and Sarah approached Fort Davis. They rode slowly, the red cloth flag held high by Windwalker, every muscle in his body tense with awareness that a single nervous sentry could end their peace mission with a well-placed bullet. "Rider approaching!" The shout came from the watchtower. "Apache with a flag!" The fort's gate remained closed, but rifles appeared along the palisade wall, trained on the approaching pair. Windwalker kept his free hand visible, maintaining a deliberate pace. Sarah rode beside him, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the fort. "Halt right there!" called an officer from the wall. "State your business." Windwalker reined in 20 yards from the gate. "I come to speak with Colonel Matthews," he called, in careful English, "about the girl and the Apache camp." A murmur ran through the soldiers on the wall. One turned and disappeared, presumably to fetch the commander. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited under the unwavering aim of a dozen rifles. Finally, the gate opened slightly. Colonel Matthews himself stepped through, flanked by armed guards. A tall man with iron-grey hair and a weathered face, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a career military man. "Windwalker," the colonel acknowledged, with a curt nod. "Bold of you to ride up to my fort after stealing a white girl." "I did not steal," Windwalker replied evenly. "I purchased her freedom at open auction. Her father sold her." Before the colonel could respond, a commotion erupted behind him. A red-faced man with a matted beard pushed past the guards, stumbling slightly as he moved, Sarah's father clearly deep in his cups despite the early hour. "There she is!" he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. "My poor deaf child, kidnapped by this savage while I was indisposed." Sarah's face hardened at the sight of her father. Without waiting for Windwalker's guidance, she dismounted and walked forward, stopping halfway between Windwalker and the fort gate. Her father rushed toward her, arms outstretched in a parody of paternal concern. "My dear child, safe at last." Sarah stepped back sharply, refusing his embrace. She pointed at him accusingly, then made the sign for selling that Windwalker had taught her, followed by the sign for lie. Her father's false concern transformed instantly to rage. "She's confused. This Apache has turned her against her own blood." He lurched toward Sarah, grabbing for her arm. Sarah evaded his grasp with the fluid grace she had developed during months of hunting with Windwalker. In the same motion, she pulled the small knife from her belt, not threatening, but establishing. A boundary her father dared not cross. Enough, Colonel Matthews intervened. Mr. Harker, step back. This situation requires clarity, not drunken accusations. The colonel studied Sarah carefully, noting her Apache clothing, but also the confident way she held herself. "Young lady, have you been mistreated by this Apache?" Sarah shook her head firmly, then pointed to her ears and mouth to indicate her inability to speak or hear. "She cannot answer your questions properly," Harker slurred. "She's been bewitched." "She can communicate in her own way," interrupted a new voice. A man stepped forward from the gathered soldiers, Lieutenant Foster, the fort's interpreter, who had spent years learning Apache dialects and sign language. "Sir, I believe I can help the girl tell her story," Foster offered. Colonel Matthews nodded. "Proceed, Lieutenant, and Mr. Harker, one more outburst and you'll be confined to quarters." Approaching Sarah cautiously, Foster made a simple greeting gesture in Plains Indian Sign Language. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition. Though not identical to the signs Windwalker had taught her, there were enough similarities for basic understanding. For the next 20 minutes, Foster engaged with Sarah in an improvised combination of signs, drawings in the dirt, and mime. The fort's personnel watched in fascination as the young lieutenant worked to bridge the communication gap. Finally, Foster turned to Colonel Matthews. "Sir, her story is consistent. Her father sold her at auction after her mother's death. The Apache warrior purchased her fairly. She has been treated well and chooses to remain with him rather than return to her father." "Lies!" Harker spat. "She's my daughter, my property by law." The word property caused a subtle shift in Colonel Matthews's expression. He had daughters of his own. "Mr. Harker, no person is property in these United States, not since the war." His cold gaze fixed on the drunk. Lieutenant continued questioning the girl. "I want to know about the Apache camp and these reports of planned attacks on our patrols." Sarah's hands moved quickly, explaining through Foster's translation that the Apache had not attacked anyone, that the cavalry's movements had been interpreted as preparation for an assault on their winter camp. As she communicated, Windwalker remained mounted just beyond rifle range, watching the exchange with tense vigilance. The fragile thread of understanding being woven between Sarah and the lieutenant was their only hope of preventing bloodshed. Suddenly, Harker lunged forward, seizing Sarah's arm and pulling her roughly toward the fort. "She's coming home with me. I've been promised a reward for her return." In the chaos that followed, several things happened at once. Sarah twisted free, stumbling backward. Windwalker spurred his horse forward, despite the rifles trained on him, and Harker's hand swept to his belt, drawing a concealed pistol. "She's mine," he screamed, aiming not at Windwalker, but at his own daughter. "If I can't have her back, no one will." A single shot echoed across the plain. The shot cracked across the open ground. Harker staggered backward, his pistol falling from suddenly limp fingers. Blood blossomed on his shoulder, where Colonel Matthews's own revolver had found its mark. "Secure that man!" the colonel ordered. Two soldiers rushed forward to restrain Harker, who cursed and struggled despite his wound. Sarah stood frozen, unharmed, but visibly shaken. Windwalker had reached her side in the chaos, one protective arm around her shoulders. Surprisingly, the soldiers had not fired upon him during his charge forward, a testament to the colonel's control over his men. "That was a foolish risk, Apache," Colonel Matthews said, holstering his weapon. "But I understand a father's instinct to protect." Windwalker's eyebrows rose slightly at the word father. The colonel gave him a measured look. "Yes, I see how it is. Lieutenant Foster, escort them both inside. Post guards, but treat them as guests, not prisoners. And get the surgeon to tend Harker's wound before he bleeds all over my parade ground." Inside the fort's headquarters, Sarah and Windwalker sat across from Colonel Matthews at his desk. Lieutenant Foster stood nearby, ready to translate. Through the window they could see the fort's surgeon treating the still protesting Harker under heavy guard. "Now," the colonel began, "I want the complete truth. The welfare of many depends on it. For the next hour, through Foster's patient. Translation: Sarah's story unfolded. She described her mother's death, her father's descent into alcoholism and abuse, and the horrifying day he had sold her at auction. She explained how Windwalker had purchased her freedom, treated her with dignity, and taught her to communicate despite her deafness. When Sarah described discovering her ability to feel vibrations through the earth, to hear through touch, what others heard through ears, the colonel leaned forward with increasing interest. "You say you can detect approaching riders before they're visible?" he asked through Foster. "That you sensed our two columns converging on the Apache camp?" Sarah nodded emphatically, drawing a quick map that matched the colonel's own campaign plans with unsettling accuracy. "Remarkable," Matthews murmured. "And you came here at great personal risk to prevent bloodshed." "We seek peace," Windwalker said simply. "The Apache have not broken the treaty. We defend only when attacked." The colonel drummed his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. "I received reports of Apache raids on settlements, 3 homesteads burned, livestock stolen." Windwalker shook his head firmly. "Not my people. We have remained in winter camp, following the old ways." Foster, who had been examining documents on a side table, spoke up. "Sir, these raid reports all came through the same source." He held up a paper, through Harker himself and his drinking companions. The colonel's expression darkened. "So I was nearly led into an unprovoked attack based on false intelligence." He fixed Windwalker with a penetrating stare. "If the girl hadn't sensed our movements, many would have died on both sides," Windwalker finished. Matthews rose and paced to the window. "Lieutenant, I want a complete written account of the girl's testimony, every detail." Foster nodded. "Sir, perhaps we should also investigate Harker's circumstances. If he sold his own daughter—" "Already underway, Lieutenant. It seems Mr. Harker owes substantial gambling debts to several unsavory characters in town. The reward he mentioned was likely promised by his creditors." Sarah watched this exchange intently, following the men's lips as best she could. When Foster translated the revelations about her father, she showed no surprise, only a sad confirmation of what she had long suspected. "What happens now?" Windwalker asked. Colonel Matthews returned to his desk. "Harker will face charges, attempted murder, false reporting, and whatever else I can find. As for the girl," he studied Sarah thoughtfully, "by law she should become a ward of the territory until she comes of age." Sarah's face paled. She reached for Windwalker's hand, her fingers gripping his with desperate strength. "However," Matthews continued, noting the gesture, "these are unusual circumstances. The territory has no facilities for a deaf child, and it's clear she has formed a familial bond with you, Windwalker." The colonel sat forward, his decision made. "I will halt the planned operation against your people immediately. Captain Reynolds won't like it, but he'll obey orders. As for Sarah," he used her name for the first time, "as I propose a compromise." He outlined his solution. Sarah would remain with Windwalker and the Apache, but Lieutenant Foster would make regular visits to check on her welfare and continue developing a more comprehensive sign language to bridge their communities. In return, Windwalker would agree to bring Sarah to the fort periodically and to notify Matthews of any unusual troop movements Sarah might detect through her unique ability. "You're asking her to be a scout," Windwalker observed. "I'm acknowledging her extraordinary gift," Matthews corrected, "and offering a path that serves peace rather than conflict." Sarah's hands moved in eager signs that Foster translated. "I will help prevent war between our peoples. This is what my vision showed, the fork in the path where I stand between two worlds." As they prepared to depart, Matthews handed Foster a document to sign. "My official report will state that the alleged kidnapping was disproven, that Sarah Harker is legally emancipated from her father due to his criminal actions, and that she has chosen guardianship with the Apache healer known as Windwalker." Foster's Pen scratched across the paper, creating the first written testimony of Sarah's remarkable journey between worlds. And perhaps a new chapter in relations between the Apache and the frontier forces. Spring bloomed across the frontier, painting the once barren landscape with wildflowers. In the shadow of Windwalker's Canyon, restored and expanded after their return from the winter camp, Sarah sat cross-legged before a small group of children. Some were Apache from the nearby band, others were the sons and daughters of settlers from the outlying homesteads. Her hands moved gracefully, demonstrating signs that the children mimicked with varying degrees of success. Among them sat Lieutenant Foster, his uniform exchanged for simple civilian clothes during these weekly lessons. He watched with undisguised admiration as Sarah patiently corrected a young Apache boy's finger positions. From the dwelling entrance, Windwalker observed the scene with quiet pride. The past months had brought changes he could never have imagined. When he'd first stood at that frontier auction block, Colonel Matthews had kept his word, halting the planned attack on the Apache winter camp and investigating the false raid reports. Sarah's father had been imprisoned for his crimes, his drinking and gambling debts eventually leading to his death in a jailhouse brawl. More remarkably, Sarah's unique abilities had become known throughout the region. Her talent for sensing approaching riders through ground vibrations had prevented two potential conflicts between settlers and Apache hunting parties. Word spread of the deaf girl who hears through the earth, and with it came a grudging respect from both sides of the cultural divide. Windwalker's Canyon was no longer a place of solitary healing, but had become a neutral ground where two worlds could meet. Once weekly, Sarah and Lieutenant Foster held lessons in the emerging hybrid sign language they were developing, a bridge of communication that incorporated Apache signs, Plains Indian gestures, and elements created specifically for concepts unique to each culture. The day's lesson complete, the children scattered to play. Foster approached Windwalker, extending his hand in the white man's greeting that the Apache had come to accept. "She has a gift for teaching," Foster observed, watching Sarah arrange her teaching materials. Wooden tablets carved with symbols, colored stones for counting, small models used to represent abstract concepts. Windwalker nodded. "She bridges worlds because she stands outside both. Her silence lets her hear what others miss." A commotion at the canyon entrance drew their attention. A rider approached, one of Colonel Matthews's messengers. The young corporal dismounted, removing his hat respectfully as he delivered a sealed letter to Lieutenant Foster. "The colonel sends his regards," the messenger said. "He requests your presence at a territorial meeting next month. Both of you." He nodded toward Windwalker and Sarah, who had joined them upon noticing the visitor. Foster opened the letter, scanning its contents. "The territorial governor wishes to observe your sign language program," he explained. "There's talk of establishing a school based on your methods, a place where deaf children and those from both cultures could learn together." Sarah's eyes widened. Her hands moved in excited signs that Windwalker translated. "A school where all children could learn to bridge silence and speak with their hands. Where Apache and settler could share knowledge. That's the idea," Foster confirmed with a smile. "The colonel writes that your work here has, how does he put it, done more for peace than a regiment of cavalry could accomplish in a decade." That evening, after Foster and the messenger had departed, Windwalker and Sarah sat beside the canyon stream. Above them, stars emerged in the deepening twilight, the same stars his ancestors had watched for countless generations. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her small hand reaching for his. She guided his fingers to the cedar flute that rested in his lap, the instrument that had first revealed her extraordinary gift on that fateful night months ago. Windwalker lifted the flute to his lips. As the ancient melody filled the canyon, Sarah placed her fingertips lightly on his arm, feeling the music vibrate through his body. Her free hand began to move, following the rhythm perfectly as it had that first night. But now her movements were not just reactions to vibrations. They had become a language of their own, signs that gave voice to the music that translated melody into visible poetry. Windwalker watched her hands dance in the firelight, telling stories her lips could not speak, but her heart understood perfectly. When the song ended, Sarah looked up at him with eyes that reflected the starlight. She touched her heart, then his, then drew a circle encompassing them both, the sign for family they had created together. Windwalker nodded, his throat tight with emotion. From his belt pouch, he withdrew a small object, a peace pipe carved from sacred red stone. Tomorrow he would smoke this pipe with Colonel Matthews, cementing their unlikely alliance. Two worlds, long separated by suspicion and bloodshed, were slowly finding common ground. And at the center of this fragile peace stood Sarah, a girl once deemed worthless by her own father, now valued beyond measure by two peoples. The child who could not hear had taught them all to listen in new ways. The girl sold into servitude had ultimately purchased freedom for many. As darkness embraced the canyon, Windwalker reflected on the strange path that had led them here. He had purchased a deaf girl with his last silver coin, expecting nothing but silence. Instead, he had found a daughter who heard the world more clearly than anyone he had ever known.